All right, Alexander, let's talk about the oil price caps. They're trying to get the oil price cap. I think the magic number now in order to get an agreement is at $62. I think Poland wanted the $30. They were at 65, 70 to 65, and now I think they're trying for $62. Anyway, you'll get into what's going on with the price cap, the oil price cap. Maybe you want to talk about the situation with gas. I was reading a report this morning that an energy CEO in France, in Paris, said that the French should brace for rolling blackouts. It is December. It is the first week of December. And so now we're really getting into winter and we're going to have 3-4 months of this. I mean, we're just starting now. So the French are starting to warn their citizens about rolling blackouts. But before you get into that, very, very quickly, I was reading a Wall Street Journal article which talked about the EU's efforts to seize Russian assets. And they said that, and this is going off of Ursula von der Leyen's statement with the 100,000 troops and all that stuff, and how she was building up, making the case for some sort of criminal prosecution, criminal indictment of Russia, Russians, and all of these people, in order to make the case that these assets could then be seized. Because according to the Wall Street Journal, the EU has been getting pushback from member states. Specifically, I think Portugal was one member state that was very vocal about it, saying, look, freezing is one thing, but seizing is something that us as Portugal, we can't do. It's unlawful. But some member states have said, well, it's unlawful to seize unless there's criminal convictions or criminal indictments. Then we have the ability to seize assets. I just wanted to get your thought on that. Is that the angle? Because it seems like they have no other angle to get these assets unless they tag on some sort of criminal conviction. Is that where they're going with this? Is this true? Will member states, if there are criminal convictions, then say, okay, there's a criminal conviction against this guy, and that guy, you can take their stuff? Do you think that's the general direction of things?
Well, that might be what they're trying to do. That might be what they're trying to cobble together. But to be absolutely straightforward about this is a complete violation of international law, well-established international law. And I understand that the legal community collectively has been giving that advice, that you cannot seize assets in that way. Freezing assets, even that, by the way, is perhaps legally dubious, but it's been done many times. There is some logic to doing it, but you can't simply confiscate assets of a country in that kind of a way. And there is one fundamental reason for this, and that is this extremely well-established doctrine of state sovereign immunity, that what a state owns cannot be seized by another state. That part of that's part of the state's property. You're not allowed to do that. And of course, talking about criminal convictions of whom exactly? Criminal convictions of Russia? I mean, a country? I mean, you can't put a country on trial. That is simply not possible. You can't put criminal convictions of the Russian central bank. On what grounds? I mean, the Russian central bank hasn't, invaded Ukraine. I mean, that simply isn't possible either conceptually. Criminal convictions of Russian leaders. Problem with that is Russian leaders themselves. You're talking about Putin. He actually also has sovereign state immunity. The only way you could put him on trial is by declaring war on Russia, winning a war against Russia, forcing Russia to surrender unconditionally, and then at that point you could put the leader of Russia on trial, which is what happened with the German leaders in Nuremberg. But if you look at the decisions of the Nuremberg Tribunal, they made that process very clear, that it was entirely conditional upon Germany's unconditional surrender. I mean, up to that point, the option of putting anybody on trial simply had not existed. In fact, it's a thread that runs through all the Nuremberg judgments. So what Ursula is talking about is absolute legal nonsense. And she's been told this, and you can see that she's trying to find a way to do something that she wants to do, despite, as I said, the legal consensus that it simply can't be done. There is another fundamental problem with this, and it goes absolutely to the root, not just of international law, but of law generally, which is that, to me, this kind of trying to construct a case, trying to get judgments on people, trying to set up tribunals within the EU. What jurisdiction does an EU tribunal have over this? I mean, there are international tribunals already. So the EU setting up its own war crimes tribunal to do this thing, but put that aside. Doing all of these things, it looks like an exercise in retrospective justice. These assets have already been frozen. You have already floated the idea that you want to confiscate these assets and seize them and take them for yourself. So you're then trying to set up a legal machinery to do that. Now, that isn't supposed to be how the law works. Firstly, there's the legal machinery is already in place. There are laws already in place which authorize you to do this thing. And then only after that machinery has been properly used in accordance with accepted legal practices, and after those accepted, established laws have been broken, are you allowed to take punitive action. What Ursula is trying to do is she's trying to do it the other way around. She's trying to do something in reverse. And the concept of retrospective justice has been accepted by every legal system I can think of in the West, going all the way back to the Romans, as an abhorrent practice, something that is profoundly and completely wrong. So my own personal view is that this is all horrendous. Now, having said all of that, it's not going to prevent her doing it. And I mean, I think this is the thing we need to understand. I mean, Portugal may have its objections, lawyers may have their objections, all sorts of people may disagree. The reality is the European Union has done so many things in its life now, which are so illegal. It's done so many things over the course of this Ukrainian crisis that are illegal, like seizing, like freezing the Russian central bank's assets, for example. That it seems to me that this is just one big further step in the same direction. So I think they will eventually do it. It is completely wrong. It will make relations between the West and Russia even worse. It is illegal. The legal community will be horrified, but I still think they're going to do it.
And it's going to do a ton of damage to the European Union. People are going to start moving their money out.
Absolutely.
But it is going to be, but they're going to do it. I agree. They're most likely going to do it. It's going to do tremendous damage. But there it is. The EU is destroying itself without Russia's help, which brings us to the oil price cap. Another decision that is going to boomerang back at the European Union. What is going on there?
Absolutely. Now, can I just say straight away, I mean, this is a crazy idea from the start. We've discussed this many times. The idea of capping an oil price, the price of a commodity, is just a guarantee, if the cap is affected, that the commodity will get into short supply. And in fact, it's unenforceable. The Indians have said they won't accept it. The Chinese have said they won't accept it. The Turks have said they won't accept it. The Indonesians don't like it. The Saudis are opposed to it because they say, if you can do that to the Russians, well, one day you might want to do that to us. We're not allowing you to. We don't want you to start capping oil prices. All of that kind of thing. So, I mean, we've said many times this is an incredibly bad idea. I get the sense now that everybody in Europe understands that, apart from, a few holdouts like the Poles and the Baltic states, which are so fervid in their visceral anti-Russianism that, as far as they're concerned, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, it bashes the Russians, they're for it. I think everybody else, the Germans, the French, the British, because the British are involved in this in some form, all of them bitterly regret that they ever went down this route. But they committed themselves to it. They agreed when there was the G7 meeting some months ago, to go down this route. So they're all talking about it. And of course, what they find is whatever price they come up with, whether it's $30 a barrel, which is what the Poles are talking about, $70 a barrel, which is what the Greeks, the Maltese, whatever those people, Cypriots, were talking about, $60 or $62 or $65 or whatever it is. You can't impose a price on a commodity that everybody needs and whose trade you don't control. So they're thrashing around trying to find a price, and one gets increasingly the sense that they're trying to pitch it at such a high price because Russian oil already trades at a discount that it won't make any difference, or so they think. It will make a difference, by the way. Or such a low price, what the Poles think, which is just a pose, really, because I can't believe the Poles really believe they're going to get $30 a barrel. But all of that, and the whole thing looks like a complete and total mess. And as I said, I think they must bitterly regret that they went down this route, but they did go down this route. It just goes to show, yet again, that they aren't thinking through what they're doing.
They have no reverse gear. And Russia has said that they are not going to sell to anybody. They're not even going to allow people to trade with any country, any bloc that decides to put a price cap. And I think the Russians, from what I understand, they don't care if it's $30 or $130.
Exactly.
If there's a price cap, they're not going to do business with these guys.
Exactly. Because of course, once the Russians accept the principle of a price cap, then of course it can just be adjusted downward. Then they will never do that. No commodity producer, no sovereign country that produces a commodity in its senses would agree to such a thing. Especially not a country like Russia, because of course at that point you no longer control the price of your own product, and they say we will do it with via supply and demand. So maybe at this precise moment in time, because we're selling oil at a discount to India, maybe the Indians are only paying $50 for the oil, but that's a price we and the Indians have agreed with each other. But if India comes along and says, well, there's this $60 price cap, Russians won't sell oil to India, which is not going to happen, obviously. But they will never agree to any price cap, and it's completely understandable why they won't. What they're most likely to do, by the way, is they are probably going to cut oil production. Now, I read a piece by a British journalist, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, in the Daily Telegraph, who said that the Russians could cut oil production by 3 million barrels a day, and it would not affect their oil infrastructure, but it would push up prices. And that would actually be good for them, because it would mean that even if they sold their oil at a discount, it'd be more profitable. And at the same time, of course, it will pile the pressure on the West as well. Now, the Russians will only do something like that if the Saudis and those countries, OPEC, were to agree. I don't think the Russians would do that unilaterally. But it's possible OPEC might agree, because they don't like this price cap either. And if the Russians are cutting production and the oil price rises, why should the Saudis be sorry?
Yeah, the collective West, they are not making friends with any of the member states. That's for sure. By pushing this price cap thing, the EU is they're making enemies of the people they need the most of the countries they need the most to survive. Anyway, two quick stories to wrap up the video. The Russians, along with China, the BRICS, India, they're trying to put together a global payment system to go up against Visa, MasterCard. They're going to use the strength of the Mir card, of the Chinese payment system, and Union Pay, and all of these payment systems. India's RuPay, Brazil's ELO, I believe it's called. Anyway, they're looking to consolidate everything into a single payment card. What are your thoughts on that? I think that's a big story. Not many people are talking about it. And I have read an article, and let me pull it up here because I have it handy, that Russia is looking to create some sort of consolidation or gas union in Eurasia with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So they've got Turkey and Turkstream. Now they're working on Eurasia. We had the meeting with Tokayev just a couple of days ago as well with Putin. So Russia they're moving pieces, it seems.
Absolutely.
All of the BRICS seem to be moving pieces. All of Eurasia. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's start with that because, of course, that also goes back to your point earlier about, the French starting to worry about blackouts because, of course, we had all that discussion about the fact that Europe is going to be okay with gas. They got it all brimming to they got the reserves all tanked up. They're not going to run out of gas this year. But, of course, what's actually happening is that they're now having to draw on those gas reserves. And they are drawing on their gas reserves faster than they can replenish them. Much faster. Now, that is normal in any winter period. I mean, even, when the gas was coming from Russia, you were, reducing the size of your reserves. But the point is, in the old days, when the pipeline gas was coming and coming steadily, you could replenish it. You might not be able to replenish it. Well, you probably won't be able to replenish it because, as we've discussed in previous programs, to the extent that they were able to tank up their reserves at all this winter, it was by buying heavily large amounts of gas from the Russians over the course of the spring and summer. So we are now running into these problems. We've started to see the first indicators of this. And of course, in France, problems are particularly bad because France relied heavily on nuclear power. Their nuclear power industry is in a mess, apparently. It's not in particularly good shape. Half their nuclear power stations aren't working. And of course, they're particularly vulnerable. And they try to get gas from Algeria. Algeria can't supply more, as they've said. Qatar is now looking to cut deals with China. It's less interested in Europe, as it turns out. And, of course, US LNG is proving very, very expensive. And the numbers there simply don't add up anyway. So we are starting to see problems. Now, if we're talking about blackouts in France or blackouts in parts of Europe, I have to say this. I think gas prices are going to start going up again. And I think they will start to go up again in the spring. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about, inflation in the Eurozone having peaked. It's only fell slightly over the last few weeks. If you undo the figures, because gas prices fell to a certain extent, they're still far higher than they used to be. But of course, if they start rising again, well, which is looking highly likely, well, then, of course, we're going to have not just problems of blackouts, but we're going to have escalating inflation again in the Eurozone. And, that's a real problem. We don't quite know how it's going to play out. There may be all kinds of factors we haven't seen. But at the moment, that looks like the most plausible thing. And in the meantime, the Russians are making their big moves. They're building gas hubs with Turkey, and they're moving to set up gas unions. Now, Tokayev, who is the new president of Kazakhstan, you remember there was that crisis last year. The Russians acted to quell the protests in Kazakhstan. They supported Tokayev. There were lots of theories and suggestions that Tokayev was actually betraying the Russians in some way or double backstabbing the Russians, that he was going to pursue a multi-vector, somehow different foreign policy, distance Kazakhstan from Russia. Well, he makes his first foreign trip to Russia. He says that Russia is Kazakhstan's key strategic partner. They get together, Putin and Tokayev get together. Putin says, look, in all our interests, let's set up a gas union. In other words, a gas OPEC. Tokayev says yes. And interestingly, it's clear that Putin and Tokayev have been discussing this with another major gas producer, which is Uzbekistan, another former Soviet republic. So Uzbekistan looks like it's in on this too. So we see three key gas producers coming together to protect the gas price. Now, there are two other big Soviet republics, former Soviet republics, which are gas producers: Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is also said to be under heavy Russian influence, so at some point it's likely to join. Azerbaijan is close to Turkey. Turkey's agreed the gas hub idea with Russia. Logically, they will want to join too. So all of these countries unify together in a single gas union, setting the price for natural gas. There's another country which is interesting, important, which is Qatar. Now, Qatar actually was the country that first floated the idea of a gas union about 5 years ago, and it suggested it to Russia. And at that time, the Russians, because they had long-term deals with the Europeans, said, look, this is going to cut across our deals with the Europeans, so this isn't for us now. But now, the Europeans have cut all those deals. So, Qatar, they might want to join in too. After all, they proposed it. If Qatar joins in, well, it's an Arab country. One other Arab country is a major gas producer. It's Algeria, also a friend with Russia. By the way, also a member of OPEC. Why shouldn't Algeria join? Why shouldn't Egypt join too, if they become a gas producer, which is quite likely? So you can see that starting with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there's a whole play here, and perhaps in a few years, maybe not very long, we will see, alongside OPEC Plus, we will see the gas union come and establish itself too. And then, of course, it won't be just the Russians that the European Union has to deal with when it negotiates gas prices. It will be all the producers, and the Russians will once again be in a position to talk about gas prices in Europe, even if they're not supplying the gas.
And put a payment system on top of all of that
Absolutely.
as well.
And put a payment system.
You're starting to build a whole different
yeah.
economic architecture infrastructure.
Absolutely. And here, it seems to me that the key countries are clear. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese, apparently now the RMB, the Chinese currency, is now a third of all foreign currency transactions in Russia are now in RMB, Chinese currency. And this is now expanding fast. And, so Mir cards, Union Pay, link all of that up, link up the sort of, messaging systems. It seems inevitable. India, major importer now of Russian oil. They're expanding their trade with Russia. Why shouldn't they do it? They're also BRICS member states. China is India's biggest trade partner. Why shouldn't India ultimately link up with China too? Yes, there's political issues between India and China, and they're big, but there are obvious economic interests. So you get all of these big countries involved. If you get all of these big countries involved, why wouldn't other countries want to be involved? Like Brazil, like Japan too, by the way. Now, Japan has its own system too, own messaging system. In fact, most people don't know, by the way. Now, interestingly enough, Japan has recently been slightly tiptoeing away from the G7. They're opening, apparently, a hotline between the Japanese and Chinese militaries. The Chinese and Japanese leaders are apparently due to meet. All kinds of discussions taking place there. So why not? BRICS reserves currency coming along. Xi Jinping going to Saudi Arabia, as we discussed. Turns out he's not just meeting MBS. All of the Arab leaders will be there to meet Xi Jinping. China's just cut a big deal with Qatar, not just, for gas. Logical to have all the payments made in the BRICS reserve currency that's coming. Logical to have all the money transfers made through this unified messaging system, which is also coming. It all makes sense. Will it happen? Well, of course, the US will do everything in its power to obstruct it, and we must never underestimate its ability to create problems and issues and to divide people. But this is the most concerted attack on the Western financial system, on Western dominance of international trade that we have seen since the 16th century.
This is the real conflict. All right.
Yeah.
The Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Rockfin as well, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOOD DAY. Take care.